Good evening, everybody. Peter Arnold asked me to remind you that there are toilet facilities to the left and to the right. He also asked me to remind you to turn off your cell phones, which I need to do as well. We are very excited to have all of you here tonight. What a great turnout. And I have the honor, the privilege, and the pleasure to introduce our two guests tonight, Fred Dunham and Jim Wickwire. I have a little bit more to say. Jim and Fred grew up together and started climbing in that mecca of mountaineering just to the east of Yakima, Ephrata, Washington. In the early 1960s, the two of them teamed up with members of Central Washington's Sherpas. It's a climbing club, but it's just the Sherpas, to form a vanguard of innovative climbers credited with a string of first ascents throughout the Cascades, and many of their exploits are detailed on the walls of our exhibit upstairs. Fred Dunham concentrated on local climbing and pioneered one of the foremost rock climbing areas in the state, Frenchman's Coulee. In his 80s, Fred's still an active climber. In fact, he just returned from a trip to Idaho's City of Rocks for tonight's event. In 1975, Fred and Jim traveled with a group of regional Northwest climbers to the Karakoram Range, along with another honored guest who's here tonight, Fred Stanley, for an attempt on the unclimbed northwest ridge of K2. Wickwire returned in 1978 to make up the first American two-man team to reach the K2 summit with Louis Reichert. Caught out in the open on the descent, Jim survived a solo bivouac at 27,600 feet. Considered by some one of the most notorious bivouacs in mountaineering history. Now this and many other hair-raising tales from Denali to Everest are recounted in his 1998 autobiography, Addicted to Danger, a memoir about affirming life in the face of death. And this is a book I can recommend highly. Recently, when discussing our mountaineering project, Jim told me that his two favorite subjects were K2 and the Willis Wall on Mount Rainier. Now, we touched on Dave Mayer's 1963 climb on Willis Wall briefly in my talk on June 14th. But tonight, you're going to get the definitive account from two of Dave's companions on that ascent. And the timing couldn't be better. In 1966, Jim wrote a letter to D. Molinart, the preeminent historian of Mount Rainier, encouraging him, and I'm quoting here, not to wait for some future time, 50 years hence, when detailing the history of Willis Wall for someone who's interested would be far more difficult. Well, the sold-out audience tonight indicates a lot of us are interested. So before we let another 56 years go by, please welcome Jim Wickwire and Fred Dunham.
Thanks, WD. I think Fred and I really wish we had another 56 years to play with. Let me start by saying that I am really delighted to be here this evening to share with you my experiences on Mount Rainier's Willis Wall. And I'm not an expert on it other than the fact that I've climbed 4 different routes on it over about a 11-year period. And so So you're just hearing it kind of firsthand from somebody who's had a lot of experience with it. I'm not a geologist. I'm not any kind of an expert on mountain architecture, if you will. So let's get on with this. I'm really happy to be here to give this talk, which I haven't really done any talking like this for almost 20 years. So, as he indicated, Fred and I are both in our 80s. Fred's still climbing. I'm walking in the mountains with grandchildren. That's about all I do. So, but I'm just really, here's what we're going to be talking about tonight. The Willis Wall, which is it's just an incredible thing on Mount Rainier that it partly the name maybe, Willis Wall, that has some resonation, but it's just the sight of it, the power of it, and so the talk tonight is to try to give you a sense of it that isn't too technical. So I'm really delighted to have Fred here. He was my first climbing partner and my closest friend from our teenage years, all the way through to our advanced stage of life. Considering where we grew up in Afraid in the middle of sagebrush country, how was it that Fred and I made a transition from being high school football teammates to becoming mountain climbers? We think we're probably the first in the town's history to do something like that. Now, I'm the standing guy in the back there with the number 1 on his jersey. Fred, all 165 pounds of him, is the lineman in front of me, hunched over in the 3-point stance. So by the time I was a teenager, how did I get into climbing? Well, one of the inspirations to me was to get hooked on the classic accounts of Himalayan expeditions of the 1950s. That reading did have the effect of interesting me in climbing and stirring my imagination about those high mountains, Annapurna, Everest, and then a mountain that didn't have a regular name. It had a first initial, a capital K, and then it had the number 2 after it. And it's had some other names that they tried to impose on it. Now, right after high school, since Fred and I weren't big enough to play college football at a high level, and we did decide that we wanted to stay in shape and not just kind of go to seed in our early years. So we became even closer as friends who worked together in the summers, and climbing seemed to be a good avenue for doing that. So we started going out to the Grand Coulee, which is north of Ephrata, where there's mainly basalt rock, but there's also a few granite outcrops. And we went up there just to kind of scramble around on those rocks. In the summer, or I should say in the spring of 1960, Mount Kashmir was the first mountain. Can you hear me okay up there? I'm stepping away, I shouldn't. But Mount Kashmir was the first mountain we tried to climb. We went too early in the season and found ourselves thrashing around in the unconsolidated snow and got nowhere even near the mountain, let alone climbing it. We both realized that if we were going to climb mountains, we better talk to people who knew something about it. After a quick trip to Seattle to buy some proper gear at the co-op, I don't know how many, everybody here knows what the co-op is, so I don't need to utter the words REI, I guess. But we went there to get some gear, but we also asked one of the people there, is there anybody over in Eastern Washington that knows anything about climbing, mountain climbing? And mention was made of the Cascadians and the Alpine Rovers in Wenatchee, and then mention of these 2 brothers in Ellensburg, Gene and Bill Prater. I should say Bill first because he was the oldest, and his slightly younger brother Gene, who were not only farmers in the Ellensburg area, but really top-notch mountain climbers. I sent Bill a letter, and back came an invitation for us to join him, his wife Barb, and other climbers for a weekend climb of Little Tahoma. From the Summerland shelter, Bill took us out on the nearby snowfields and gave us what amounts to the only instruction we ever had of climbing in our entire lives, just that first day. Well, I've gone ahead myself here a little bit. So, but he did get us out teaching us about how to walk on snow, how to hold an ice axe, how to sail for rest, how to glissade on our butts, you know. So it was it was a great way to learn. I mean, that was one way to learn. The best way to learn, though, was to get with Bill and Jean, and they found this wild creature in the environs of Mount Furno, up along Lake Chelan. And I don't know where they got him, but he was something else. Dave Mayer was the other one. They were our early mentors, and soon became our climbing companions. From the start, they shaped our approach to climbing. No more instruction. Just go out on the mountains with them and pay attention to what they're doing. That is a great way to learn. For them, it wasn't about getting up the mountain by the easiest way, but by taking routes more difficult and challenging. If it was an unclimbed route, all the better. Now, that is I mentioned this background because that is the fundamental reason why we did the kind of climbing we did, was because of the way they did it. And we didn't know how good they were when we started, but they were among the very best in the state of Washington at the time. Of course, sadly, they're gone from us now, but Fred and I will be always deeply grateful for the way they welcomed these two young guys from Ephrata into their world of climbing, and out of that came an enduring friendship with them that has stayed with us to this very day. In the sense of looking back on that relationship. Here's Fred with Dave on one of those early climbs, and then he was up with Gene and something called Yellow Lichen Towers, which are up near outside of Ellensburg to the north, a little west of Mount Stewart. And now I'll get to Willis Wall. How did I learn about Willis Wall? Well, it was in early June of 1961 that Fred had just come back from an attempt to reconnoiter it, but maybe even climb it. He and Gene and Dave and Barry Prather was in on that. Barry was another outstanding young climber from Ellensburg who ended up becoming the youngest member of the 1963 Everest Expedition American. And so Fred, when he told me about this, we'd kind of been out of touch, and he had moved to Ellensburg to work for Dave in his apple harvest, and then that winter he was up at White Pass at the ski area up there. Now, here's the amazing thing. We climbed that first summer pretty much on our own of 1960, but by the fall of 60 and getting into the winter and the spring of 61, those two guys are asking Fred Dunham to accompany them on an attempt to Willis Wall. Now, what does that say about Fred? That tells me that he was a viewed by them as a really outstanding climber. And I was kind of out of the picture at that point. I was off at school, college in Spokane, but it was great to see that happening for Fred. Now, what happened in the next 2 weeks, they did go in June. The weather was bad. They didn't get very far, came back out. On their way out, no, it's Fred. I'm telling you, this is not climbing. This is circus stuff. But it shows you some of his power. Now, they were coming back down Moraine Park. Now, this is not Fred. That's my wife, Mary Lou, and I took her and a couple of my daughters out to go show them what Willis Wall looked like, and you can see it kind of in the distance. And it was trying to, persuade them that it wasn't as difficult and dangerous as it was said. But Fred recalls on the way down the moraine coming upon this single climber who was kind of sleeping or loafing or wherever he was under this downed tree. And he'll come back in this story tonight, or this talk tonight, because what happened in the next 2 weeks was something so extraordinary that it generated a controversy that went on for several years and took quite a while to play out and be resolved. All this came in the context of a significant shift in attitude on the part of the very few climbers who like to climb, who wanted. I'd say very few climbers like the Prater brothers and Dave Mayer, who wanted to tackle an unclimbed face on Rainier like the Willis Wall. Now, I want to offer a single photograph that I found in an old book that many of you have probably read, John Williams's 1911, The Mountain That Was God. And in that was this photo, this old photo. And if that doesn't tell you something about Willis Wall, you won't understand much more. But there was the major threat of an avalanche coming down, and that's covering a large part of the entire face. But I want you to be the judge of some more modern photos and get some sense of what it looks like close up and personal, if you will. Now, let's start with Liberty Ridge. As you can see, Liberty Ridge it's an elegant line up the mountain. It's one of the most classic routes on Rainier, and I want you to notice how the ridge juts out from the mountain with steep flanks on either side. And I mention this because on the left side where Liberty Ridge ends, you see kind of a gully coming down. That's where Willis Wall begins and extends to the east or to the left. So that it's a gully that defines kind of that boundary, at least as I see it. I've never heard anybody express it quite that way. Now you can see in this photograph that was in the excellent book that the museum published on the exhibit, this photo by Lowell Skoog, an aerial photo of Willis Wall, and you see these parallel ribs, vertical ribs that go across the face to the left of Liberty Ridge. They're called ribs because they don't stick out very far from the face. If they did, they'd be called ridges or cleavers. So it's just a term it's a simple term, but I think it's very descriptive. Now the westernmost rib, called the west rib, goes up there, and let's see if this thing is working. So here's the west rib going up, and it really terminates right in here, although the climbing route that's later done goes up and then on up higher. and that's not really on the west rib. The west rib is right here, but that's the name that's given to it. Now, that higher part of it that I'm referring to is this. This is the west rib right there, coming up to the ice cliff, and then the roots that have been done go on up here and then come across to Liberty Ridge. They don't climb any of these ice cliffs, the early ones. Now we go to the other two ribs, and you can see they're quite different. They're not as, they look a little harder, and I think they are. And I'll come back to him shortly. But here's the central rib and the east rib. And this is the one that I'm going to talk about the most at the early part of this talk. And this is the route that Dave Mayer figured out that went on up in 1963. This is Charlie Bell, and there were rumors circulating in 1961 that a solo climber by his name had climbed Willis Wall. And he's the same fellow that Fred encountered in Moraine Park. And he stayed around for several days afterwards and came back to Seattle and made a claim that he had climbed Willis Wall on his own. No one believed him. The question on most people's minds was, how could an unknown climber from outside the Northwest waltz in and pull off such an astonishing feat? Bell did not take a camera on his 1961 climb, and when the disbelief rose to a crescendo, he returned in 1962 with a camera to do it again. Both of those climbs of his were unauthorized, and he was later fined by the Park Service for failing to, well, you couldn't even register for it in those days. Now, I do want to mention one thing about that. I talked about this. I'll get this right in a minute here. Whoops. There. Okay, this is the central rib, and this is the east rib that Dave Mayer is the father of, as far as I'm concerned. And it goes on up into this area. I'd say from 1955 on, it was Dave Mayer more than any person, any other climber, who was trying to figure out how to do a Willis Wall climb safely. Dave had good reason with his large family, and I'm not sure how many children he had at the time, but he ended up with 9, so he certainly had a lot of them in the 50s that had started to come. Dave's careful study convinced him that the east rib offered the most protection because it extended out away from the wall more than the other two, as you saw in that dirty appearance of the sharp ridge. And to do a complete, what he wanted to do was a complete route he wanted to come up into this area. You can't see the lower part, but basically he wanted to come up these rock bands and then come up through here, which he ended up calling Traverse of the Angels, and then getting off of the wall and onto this relatively low-angle glacier and going on up to Liberty Cap. That was his plan and what he wanted to do. and as I mentioned, he spotted that ledge, which was the key to the whole thing. I'm going to switch hands here. I'm a lefty, and holding that thing in the right hand and messing with paper in my, it's not working too well. That's why I'm fumbling around up here a little bit. So what happened was, since they didn't get into Willis Wall and do anything in '61, well, you got to wait till the next year in May or June, because one of Dave's precepts about Willis Wall is don't go there in the summer when it's warmer, or you're going to have more avalanches and more rockfall. So get there when the mountain is in a frozen condition. And so in June of '62, the team now was changed a bit. Dave was still the key player, but for some reason Gene Prater decided that he didn't want to go up Willis Wall. And so Fred was still in the picture, and Barry Prather, and yours truly is invited to go on that trip. Fred and I were given the task of going in 2 days ahead of the others, and our job was to assess the proposed route and to wand it in the event there's a storm and poor visibility, we could find our way down from the upper mountain. Now, the weather had been a little bit unstable, but it got clear this one day, and for the first time, I could start seeing what this thing is, and I must tell you, it is really impressive to be standing under something like this. These photos don't do it justice. And so the ice cliffs at the top are absolutely incredible. And you remember that old photo, that 1911, I mean, you don't know when those avalanches are going to break loose. So Fred, we walked up closer. Now, we were looking for a good spot to go across the Bergstrand to get up on the actual climb, not for us to start right now, just to see where there was a good spot. So Fred walks up to that little short cliff there. He's not up there in this photo, and he only had to go up about 10 feet to be able to say, this will work. But what I don't think either he or I realized, that this was right at the base of the avalanche gully between the east rib and the central rib. So while we were there, a little shower of rocks came rolling down, and Fred jumped down behind that 10 foot of vertical ice, and I'm down below, and the rocks are flying. They weren't big ones, but then all of a sudden this one about the size of a basketball comes, and it sounds like a runaway airplane, and I was doing the St. Vitus dance to avoid that nailing me. So we start up. We decide to come back because the weather crapped out again, just like the year before. And so Fred and I left the mountain, walked down, and Dave and Barry Prather, and even Fred Stanley, who had started really climbing with us in the winter of '62, and everybody could see he had great potential, and so he came in to see what this was all about, and ended up having some great climbs with him over the years. But Bill and Gene in '63 were coming back, and it's Dave Mayer, Fred Dunham, myself, and then since Barry Prather was going to go to Everest, we had to find a fourth, and that turned out to be Don Anderson. So we went in with the Prather brothers and Fred Stanley to act as a support party, because the National Park Service would not allow you to climb something like Willis Wall and maybe some of the other north side routes without a support team. But Gene and Bill felt they had to leave to go back to the farm, and they did, leaving Fred Stanley remaining with the radio that they left for him to have direct contact with us. We started, and here's Fred, in this shelter that we kind of camped in when you get up close to Willis Wall. We started from the 7,500-foot camp at roughly 10:30, and the idea was we'd just go up the Carbon Glacier to the base of the wall and get onto the climb just as daylight was coming right here, and that's what we did. Now the hardest climbing, we could look over to Curtis Ridge on the left, but the hardest climbing was up the rock that you see that has the sunshine on it, kind of on the right side. It was about 100 feet of really not very good rock and a little bit of an overhang at the top. And Don Anderson was having some problems with his condition at this point. The other three of us had been up Rainier a week before, up the Mowich Face, so we were in really good shape going into this climb. And but Don Anderson led that 100-foot pitch and got us up onto the crest of the East Rib, and this is what we could see up the ridge with the ice cliffs high above. We took our first rest spot up on top the rib, and that's Don Anderson at the left. I'm in the middle, and of course Dave Mayer, that you all know so well. Here's Fred moving up a little higher. You see that kind of rocky tower right on the crest of the ridge. And we noticed that the weather there was a change coming. You can see it's kind of like a cloud cap was starting, and we're a little concerned. In those days, you didn't have satellite weather reports. You just kind of, look at the sky and see what's going on. And the problem with the north side of Rainier, of course, is that the weather's all coming from the other side of the mountain, and you don't see it till it gets there. We could look across to Liberty Ridge, and the sky was clear, but it's just, we're just a little apprehensive at this point. Now, to go higher, we had some short rocks to get, little cliff things here, and that's Dave leading with Don Anderson. And then we got up to that traverse I mentioned earlier, where we went across where Dave is at the left, over to those rolling kind of rounded. That's the top of the central rib, and you can look up and see here's the ledge, the Traverse of the Gods is right there. So we've got to go up, climb that rock, and then get on this ledge and work up it to this steep area that then gets you to some easier climbing up higher. Now, as we got closer, the weather really got a little bit worse, the visibility, and this is showing you a closer view of what I just talked about, which is here is the Traverse of the Angels, and the key spot is right there because it narrows down to about that wide, and there's a roof over it that you can barely get on your knees. The roof is so low, and there's a sharp drop off on your right. So it's really a nasty spot, not hard climbing. It maybe hard crawling would be a better word. Now, just as we were going up that last slope to get up there, we saw our only avalanche of the day.
off to the west. And pardon me on this, but this is the top of the west rib, right here. But it was the only one we saw, and we were nowhere near it. Now, getting up to the exit ledge, you can see the drop off there, and this doesn't really give you it's a lot smaller there than it looks with that overhanging roof, and you really can't stand up properly on it. So we all got up that, and we then headed off to higher ground. And here, so where we were was right there, and we're moving up beneath this little rock band, and then some steep climbing here. And by this time, the weather's really turning sour. We can't, very low visibility. And we get up on this glacier section. The ice cliff, the upper ice cliff extends over it, and then the lower ice cliff starts here and goes on across and up. And I talked about that arch thing, and Liberty Ridge is right here. The upper part of Liberty Ridge with Liberty Cap. Here is a view down on Fred, and he's got that sun cream on his lips. He was famous for it. But looking down, as you can see, the weather is really turning bad. Now, we were concerned about dawn because as we got up close to Liberty Cap, we were really up on that low angle area, and on the other side, we didn't know where we were. We knew we were close to Liberty Cap, and dawn would start. He would stop and he would just lie down in the snow and kind of just be. Didn't have much activity going on, and we were worried about him. We didn't know, this was early in understanding pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, high altitude illnesses like that. But we knew one thing, that we had to get him on his feet and keep moving, and we had to head down the mountain. We had to get him down to lower altitude, and that would really be helpful to him. So what we ended up doing, and I would credit Fred here and Dave being the two that really took charge in this situation and were trying to figure this, the best way to go down. I was back kind of working a little bit with Don at that point, and I had this curious thing. Gene Prater would weld, and Bill would weld crampons into a solid thing. And if you wear those things for a long time and you got certain problems with your feet, you really get a lot of pain with them. So I was experiencing a little of that up there, but I shook it off, and we all continued over to the top of the Mowich face and went right down the Mowich face. We came from Liberty Cap and then right down through here. And this is the route, basically the route we'd climbed the week before. So we knew, we couldn't see it. We weren't for sure, we didn't know for sure that we were actually going down the Mowich face, but we thought we were. And it wasn't until we got down lower, and we really didn't see anything until we kind of came out of the clouds, and you could see these colonnades over on the South Mowich Glacier, and we knew where we were at that point. So we went down off the glacier, down the South Mowich River, and went off in the trees to try to get a fire going and to eat something and spend the night there. And here we are the next morning. You can't see it here, but Dave had some snow blindness, and he was really having some problems with his eyes. The next morning, we could just walk out from the trees and look up at the Mowich face that we'd come down. And then I think it's Duke's in Enumclaw. It's where all the Sherpas go to have big breakfasts. And so that's where we celebrated the climb, with Don on the left, Dave with the sunglasses to help his snow blindness, and Fred on the right. So it was, this climb really stirred up a lot of information, a lot of newspaper coverage, both locally as well as even some nationally. And at this point, because Charlie Bell was kind of in limbo, nobody really believed that he had done it. Not even after when they saw the photos the second time, they said, well, he was just on he was on Liberty Ridge, and he just got off of Liberty Ridge and took these photos across, and that's what he had done. So there was a lot of skepticism about him. And so the next Willis Wall climb that I did was in February of 1970 with Alex Bertulis, who was a Seattle architect, who was a native Lithuanian. And so we got together and we were going to go try to make a winter ascent of the West Rib, and without knowing for sure where Charlie Bell had gone. We knew he had gone somewhere in this area, but we didn't know exactly where. So we started that climb, and it was pretty good conditions, actually. The weather did turn. I mean, every Willis Wall climb that I've been on but one had really bad weather at some point up high on the mountain. So here we are going up the Carbon Glacier, and the objective is the West Rib, which I've outlined to you. It's the one kind of right in the middle, slightly to the right of middle. And what we did a week before the climb is we hired a pilot to fly us around the mountain, and we were looking for a place to not go over to the right, close to Liberty Ridge. We wanted to do what Dave Mayer did, which was to figure out a route that was a complete climb of Willis Wall, up the face, and in his case, through the ice cliffs. So what we were looking for here was a ramp or something that would allow us to get up in that spot about the middle of the photograph, rather than going off to the right to Liberty Ridge. And I think I can say with certainty that it's not easy to make judgments about climbing routes from the air. And that's happened to me more than it happened on K2, which really was a major factor in some of the problems we had on the expedition, because Lou Whitaker and I thought we saw a route which wasn't there, and it really sent us down the wrong track. But here we go, going up the West Rib, and you can see it above Alex in a corner of the floor. And those ice cliffs are up there and stand out. Alex preferred to climb on the rock, and you're up there and you're not trying to be a pristine rock climber and just stay on the very crest. You want to get up this thing because speed is of the essence. You don't want to be there so long that the chances of rock fall or avalanche coming off, you're there when it happens. So here we are going up, and I would say we were kind of slow, but we made progress. And we got up and it opened up, and we're looking up, and where we're trying to get up this, and then there are these rock bands, and there's ways. It's really deceptive because you can almost just walk right through here. It's steep, but you can just kind of go up like that, staying to the left, and then our this area that we had these, where we thought we saw a ramp, was in this area, right in there. So we kept going higher, but when we get up here, I took this photo down really just to kind of show we were up on a mountain and look down to the glacier. And And this, oops, I don't want to do that one yet. Hold it. Okay, there I am. So here, this feature is what we didn't pay any attention to it when I took the photo, but this turned out to be a kind of an important key to Charlie Bell's account of his 62 climb when he had the camera. And of course, the toe of Liberty Ridge is down here. That's the Carbon Glacier. Alex is up ahead of me here, and we're getting up close to the ice cliffs are up in the clouds now. And just a few minutes a few minutes after I take this photo, an avalanche comes down right in front of Alex out of the gully. Not a big one, but it broke the spell. We knew that things weren't frozen in frozen condition. We knew that something was headed in the wrong direction. So we kept climbing higher, and we were really, we didn't talk about it too much, but you become apprehensive about your situation, and you just want to keep heading up. And when we went past this thing, which was, this is as you can see, the ice cliff, and it was in the area where those ramps were. They're up to the right, and when we went a little higher, and we were looking at it, it was quite different on the ground than it had been from the air. And it was getting late in the day. This is winter, not much daylight. And so we knew that we didn't have time to do that. And at this point, we're about, excuse me again, I'll get this right, I hope. At this point, we're right in here. And so what we decide is we got to find a place to spend the night because it's starting to get dark. So we come up and we get right there, 60 feet below the base of that ice cliff. And we go out into the middle of the slope thinking that the snow is going to be a little deeper out there maybe, and we'll have, it'll be easier to carve out a platform for us to sit on for the night, which is what happened. And we end up, I'm trying to think of whether we had shovels. We didn't have shovels, we were just using our ice axes. And it was, ice was not far below the snow, but we managed to carve out a spot there that was okay. And we didn't have our legs dangling over the edge, but they were close to that. And it got dark, and then these huge avalanches started coming out of the ice cliff below us off to the right, and they went down onto the glacier, and we saw them later. It was an incredible amount of big blocks of ice. So it was a major piece of that corner of that ice cliff, a little bit lower from our bivouac that went down. In the morning, and of course we didn't sleep at all, but we sat there and we could look up the 60 feet to the base of the ice cliff and then across to Liberty Ridge. And it was kind of a tricky traverse. I started across and got into these rock features, and I said, no, I'll go down a little bit. So I went down about 40 feet on belay and then went across, and we just belayed our way across, and that was 5 pitches across there. It's not small. These are big places. And we got over to where the ice cliff ends right there, the right-hand side of that sickle. And we had to rappel off the other side about 75 feet down onto some water ice. And Alex, the way he did a pendulum down at the bottom to get out onto some better snow. And then I followed him. And what we did, it was a complete whiteout. it looks good here, but by the time we started across and got across, the ceiling came down from above, and we had almost zero visibility, and we wanted to go up to Liberty Cap, at least do that. We couldn't get out that ramp, but we couldn't see anything, and so we just decided to descend. We were off Willis Wall at this point, so we decided to descend Liberty Ridge down to our snow cave, which was behind this kind of serac down at the Bergschrund. So that's looking up Liberty Ridge. The flanks of it are on the right, and the route is over there on the left that we had climbed. Now let's get to Charlie Bell here for a minute, just to bring him up to date in this story. Our climb, and I want to be very careful about what I say here because it's just you want to be accurate, and it's a complicated story about where have people gone and what proof do they have to have done it, and I think all of us want to believe people when they tell us they've done something, and I came to finally conclude, as did Dee Molinar, that we did accept Charlie's 61 climb without on his word, without a camera. But what happened in 62, and this is documented in Dee's second edition of his book, The Challenge of Rainier, and in off Belay, if you're familiar with that, with Ray Smutek. So what happened was, in 61, Charlie was down here, and he went up all the way up this way, and he actually bivouacked somewhere up in here. And then he went up higher, and I think he came across a little bit lower than we were, up about there, and he came across here, because there's no way that Charlie could have climbed down what we rappelled down. And what we were interested in was being as close to where the ice cliff touched Liberty Ridge. We were trying to really, make the best climb we could make. And so, just a moment. Okay, back to this. So what happened was Alex and I published an article in the American Alpine Journal that suggested and said that our climb was a first ascent, not just a first winter ascent, but it was a first ascent, because there'd been nobody accepted Charlie Bell at this point, even with the photos he had. So I said, we got to get to the bottom of this. So I found Charlie, and I started having some correspondence with him, and he sends me all his photos. I sent them on to Dee Molinar eventually, and he's describing what he did in 62, and he, in 62, this is really giving me fits. There we are. Sorry about this. Okay, so what Charlie had in off Belay was a panorama he took at a point he called it Point X. And Point X was he couldn't get across the Bergschrund, so he went back to, I didn't mention this, back to that. He went back to the toe of Liberty Ridge, and then he wanted to go back over to as low as he could get on the west rib, and then he'd be able to repeat his 61 route completely. So the comparison of the photos showed that instead of going across that lower yellow line, he actually took this ascending traverse up from the flanks. These are the flanks of Liberty Ridge, and the gully that separates. Right, there's the main gully between them is right in here, you know, the dividing line. So his photos showed that he did that. And then when he got up to here, he really had a fixation on point X. So when he put his panorama out, this was his point X. Well, that's point X. He agreed that was point X. This was at 11,500 feet, which matched the photos going up that angle. And so it was I found him to be a really honest guy, because he at that point he said, this is a great line of his. And he says, you know, I was Lindbergh, now I'm wrong way Corrigan. Because he had been, in my mind, and I was trying to be helpful to, you know, that he was just confused, it seemed to me, and and how do I know what's going on in anybody else's head? But what he did was he took these photos. This is the ice cliff that we've been looking at, and where the red circle is are Charlie's footprints across there. And you know, it looks almost like a trench. You see a white line of, you know, it's not, and D, that's what D said it was. And so D concluded that it showed that Charlie had actually been there, not just that the photo across data was probably proof enough. I mean, you could argue that these were taken from Liberty Ridge, but that I don't think that happened at all. So D rushed out a second edition of The Challenge of Rainier, and he printed in there the entire account of Charlie's 61 climb in Charlie's words. And he also described the 62. He didn't really get into what I've just talked about in terms of the point X thing. I mean, that's getting a little bit too technical. It took, this is all going on in 72, so the climb was in 61, so we're 11 years out that the climbing world has accepted Charlie Bell's solo climb of Willis Wall, which is really absolutely, I mean, thinking about Willis Wall it's one of the, without doubt, one of the most amazing episodes in Rainier's long mountaineering history. And I think it's a classic case of how much doubt can be generated when someone does the so-called impossible and can't prove it by word alone. So to come back a year later with a camera and go up this thing again by himself is, I mean, that's pretty impressive. It should be to anybody. And he, of course, the second time he manages to find the register on Columbia Crest, and in there he sees a note from Ed Cooper and Mike Swain, who had climbed an unauthorized climb of the east side of Willis Wall, and they arrived at a day before I think Charlie got there and saw their note, and Charlie leaves a note that describes his 61 climb, acknowledging that he did it without a permit or it was an illegal climb, and then he describes his 62 climb. So he got a double dose of citations. And then Charlie, he's great, he'd write these letters to the Park Service, and he'd try to get them to waive the fee, and he was pretty artful in how he did that. And their letters back were really friendly, and they were, lauding his climb, and yet I think he ended up paying $50 or something. But he was he came to my office once, and so I've actually seen him face to face, and it was a nice conversation. It was a busy day for me, and we didn't talk much and we knew everything anyway. So that's how it ended. And again, I felt good about trying to get to the bottom of that. But what does my opinion matter? I mean, I'm just a climber but it's the key person here is D. Molinar. D is he's the mountaineering historian of Mount Rainier without any doubt. And D was a very close friend of mine, and I just want to say one thing kind of about him that's a little bit off to the side, but he was in that famous accident on K2 in 1953 when George Bell slipped on the ice and all of them were falling, and Pete Schoning's belay held him. And Dee was part of that, and he saw better what happened than anyone else. And it had to do with how they tied the ropes to Art Gilkey's the sleeping bag he was in, that they were trying to bring him down. He had thrombophlebitis. He was dying, and they made this heroic effort to get him down. And this is not the subject of Willis Wall, but it's a subject of, I'm talking about Dee's character. And some of the members, in particular Bob Bates, was kind of trying to make Dee a hero, that he was the only one that tied in a rope to Art Gilkey that caused the climbers to all become entangled. And that didn't ever come out. Dee believed that he saw Bates and Houston tied into Gilkey too, so that their rope contributed. So it was kind of a test of integrity and honesty to me, the way. And it got a little bit of press, but it was never really, never completely discussed and before the end of the lives of all of them. So anyway, again, key figure in the Charlie Bell controversy, D. Molinar, in my opinion. So what do you do after you've been up the East Rib of Dave Mayer and Fred Dunham and Don Anderson, and you've gone up with Alex Bertoulis up the West Rib? Well, there's the old Central Rib sitting there waiting for you. And so that's what I decided I wanted to do. And it was really a mistake on my part, because this was in the spring of 1971, and I had been engaged as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the native people of Alaska who were getting a settlement of their land claims. And I was gone out of Seattle on that all spring, and all I could do was to go out and jog around a little bit out of the hotel. So I, in a sense, was the Don Anderson of 1971 with Ed Bolton, because Ed climbed Rainier the week before we did the climb.
That's what we did, what the three of us did with Don Anderson. So here he was, Ed Bolton, 44 years old. I was 31 at the time. Short, stocky, all-around mountaineer. He didn't ever want a big climbing reputation. He knew who he was, but to go up there with him and what happened is why I'm standing here tonight. And I'll tell you some of that story in just a minute. So here we are. We go up. I've dropped my notes here, and I can move a little. I'm still within the time limits, aren't I? WD. Am I okay? Am I okay? Okay, keep going. This is more fun than reading stuff here. I go to the slides and I talk. So that's a better way to do it. I'm learning. Even at 82, I can learn something, right? So here we go. On the way in, we run into. So we're going to go in, Ed and I, the two of us. And we go up the moraine, and there's Lee Nelson on the right, or on the left, and Rob Shaler in the tent. Lee was from Ashford. He was a fireman, I think, and Rob was a surgeon in Seattle. He and I had done some Rainier climbs together before this. And so we find ourselves, the four of us up there on the Curtis Ridge side of the Carbon, looking up at. This is the East Rib, right here. So they were going to go up. They were talking about going up, Lee and Rob, and repeating our 63 route. Whereas Ed and I are going to go further to the right and get up on this thing, the Central Rib. And so Lee's got this radio, and he's getting a weather report. And it says the weather's going to be perfect for 2 days at least. So Ed and I decide, why don't we just go light? Let's leave stuff here. Let's go up and make a one-day climb of that rib, and then come down Liberty Ridge, and we're done. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. So we head up. It was May 11th, 1971. And we get across the Birch Run, and he's up ahead, or that's me up ahead. He's shooting black and white film, I'm shooting color film on this trip. So we're on the right side of the rib, and we're kind of at the left edge of the base of the rib. And where are we? We're in Dave Mayer don't go there territory. Because his mantra was, don't get off those ribs, stay on them as much as you can. So we're headed up, and Ed's, he's yelling at me, we need to get over on the rib, to the left. So we find an easy way to walk across to get on it. And he's just reached it, and I soon join him. No sooner do we get on that rib than this huge avalanche breaks off from the upper ice cliff, and it's coming down the very gully we were in, and it's loud, and it's the visibility. I mean, it was something else. And guess what? Ed gets a photo of the avalanche. How did he do that? I do not know. But this is the you can see it. It's not when it was rolling through. I mean, when it's rolling through, we're taking cover. But he turned, and you can see some of the debris out on the glacier. Maybe this is within minutes of it, when the cloud's gone down. So okay, that's that. All right. So what we're experiencing on this climb is the hardest ice conditions that I've found on Willis Wall on all the trips. And I'm in the lead here, and
I'm enjoying it because it's hard to find good ice climbing on Rainier, you know, at least it's been that for me. So Ed had two things here. He had non-rigid crampons, and he had these old floppy boots. So he couldn't, I can't even see if he's got front points on those crampons, but he couldn't front point. And he was like, it's like he's on a beach, you know, like a crab trying to get, but I'm impressed with this. I mean, he's there for it. So he wanted to keep exchanging leads, and I said, fine, you know, and so here he is up the lead, and this was one of the harder pitches. It was about 55 degrees, and there he goes, and he's chopping steps as he goes up, you know, the old-fashioned way. And as we get higher, guess what? Weather's getting worse again, and there's the ledge right there. And we're trying to, you know, find, you know, probably going to go up in this area, but we're trying to find the best way, and it just doesn't look the same as 63. This is 8 years later. It just, the rock has got ice on it. So we get up closer, and this is still on the rib, I think. You can see the ledge up higher, just above the white ice. But it's getting worse, the weather. It's not, and what happened to that forecast? What happened to that forecast? And when that avalanche came down, and we saw, I should bring you back, Nelson and Shaler were down there, kind of in the dark, and we saw them with the headlamps, and they were going down. And we couldn't figure, this was right at the beginning, we couldn't figure out why, and it was because they were getting rockfall in the dark on the other side of the east rib. And we never saw any more of them. And then when that avalanche came down, Ed and I talked about, should we go down? And we said no, because we'd have to go back down we're out of that gully now, and we do not want to go back down that gully. And there was no way to get really out the other way. It was a kind of a drop-off on the other side. Willis Wall, it is like being in the jungle with a lot of unfamiliar trees and, you know, you're trying to figure out where you are. And I would take photos with me and put them in the pack, black and white. You're trying to figure this thing out and exactly where you are. It's helpful, but doesn't get you there all the way. So here again, we're up there, and I just want to. You can see the red route line. Now, what happens here is, you see that little jog to the left? That's where I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to get up to the ledge. And so I say, Ed, I'm going to go around the corner here and go over and see if where I am. And we had these prototype Penberthy orange, short orange ice axes, metal ice axes. I don't know if any of you ever saw them, ever used them. So we were using them on this climb, and I had a Chenard ice hammer with me. So I go around that corner, and it's very icy, but it looks better over here. There's snow, and what I didn't realize was that snow was about that thick, and beneath that was water ice. And so I stepped, and I started to slip, and I whammed in the ice axe by itself, and the fall did not start. And I was just like, wow, you know. And so I took a few more steps. Same thing happened again in a place that looked like it should be better. The angle wasn't as bad. And this time I went down about 5 feet, and whammed the two ice axe and and the ice hammer in and stopped. Never lost I never lost my footing or my stance. I mean, I was contained. I mean, it was, and then Ed comes around the corner and says, well, he says, I had a really bad belay on you. I don't think it would have worked. So we are talking about, we just about went for a 3,500 foot ride down the mountain. And I mean, that was, and I think it's, you know, a lot of climbers maybe have experiences like this, and they don't like to talk about them. Well, I don't enjoy talking about them either, but I think it's instructive that no matter how experienced you are, you can mess up. So here we are, and we go up. Gee, I'm going to get this done in just about the time. Have faith, WD. All right. So here we are. We go up, and this next part of this is incredible. So here was the way it was in '63. This time, and by the way, this entire roll of film that you've been seeing of this climb, it was a defective roll from Kodak that had all these chemical stains on it. And my brother, who's a master with fixing stuff like this in Portland, he turned those horrible slides into master. I mean, they were great. So now this one he couldn't. This was so bad it had yellow and green and stuff. But here's Ed, and so he's right at a blob of snow and ice that is blocking any further movement along the ledge. And there, I guess that roof isn't quite as high as I made it sound, but it's still there. But the ice was like it was just hanging and stuck there. So he starts burrowing his way through it. And he disappears on the far side. And he's doing it without his pack, so guess who has to push the two packs through? And it was a claustrophobic space for sure. And a lot of, but Ed was just, I mean, the guy is tough. He's deceased. He died at 91 about 2 to 3 years ago. But so we work our way through, and this is where all this is going on, is right there. Right in there. And now we're going up that, we're going up, we get to the easier ground, and we move up, and Ed's coming up behind me, and he says, you know, I saw this little hole, just a real tiny place back down there right under the rock, and it's getting late, and the storm is getting worse, and so we go back down there and probe around a little bit, and sure enough, inside is this little cavern with a low roof where we can sit face to face the whole night. So here's Ed. I get one of him, and he gets one of me. And that was what was out the door. And so we're there the whole night, and during the night, these avalanches are coming down from up high, and they're just hitting the slope right below us. And it's really noisy stuff. I mean, it's almost a ground shaking. Okay, so in the morning, we're looking out the front door, down the porch and out into the yard of a really bad storm. And then we go up, and normally, when you get up off that, we had a little tough time getting up this part, but when we get to here, the new snow that is accumulated is waist deep. Now, Ed, at this point, Ed was about 5'5", I always thought it was 5'8". I never made it quite. But so we're going across this, what should have taken us just a few hours, and it takes us the whole day to go from where we spent the night up to the second blue dot, which is Liberty Cap. See up there where against the sky, and it was 6 or 7 hours after we had fiddled around on the steeper stuff. And the storm is intensifying. The winds are really getting gale-like. And we decide we need to dig in. We were going to go down the Emmons. And no, we got to dig in. And so what happens is that, and where we are is, all this happens right there, right in that area. And, I don't know how many people have read my book, but just go read Addicted to Danger. Go read there's a part of a chapter that tells this story in some detail. I have a lot of detail here. I'm skipping it because there's not much to say other than I'll just describe it briefly. But we start digging a snow cave, and we get it partially dug, and it collapses. Then we get a second one going, and finally it's going to work, and we crawl in, and it was just big enough to get in there, and the roof was about like this over you, and pretty soon the door is completely plastered shut with new snow, just boom. And Ed is spooked about suffocation for good cause. So he keeps poking his ice axe through the top of the roof. And finally he decides, I've got to get outside. And he just bowls his way out through this new snow that's packed us in. And he goes out the door, and I'm lying in there thinking, God, I don't want to go out there, Because the winds, you can easily overestimate wind speed, but we were thinking 75. I don't know what it was, but it was really, really moving. And so I go out there, and he, we're in we kind of get over the entrance, and then we get packed in again and break free of that, and I had a bivouac sack that we both were in, and it ripped apart, right? With the wind just ripped it right on us. And so we used it. All we could do was grab it and wrap it around us. And the best thing I had with me in the way of equipment, I was wearing a JanSport frame pack that was kind of like a rucksack, small, but it was about that wide. And that allowed us to sit down on it, the two of us out there, for the rest of the night with our backs to the wind. And I think that was a real factor in getting through that night. And then Ed was preoccupied with calories. He wanted to, and he had some, I had an orange in a pocket, and he had some peanuts, and so he's feeding me the peanuts one at a time. And we finally, it clears, and the wind is still blowing hard, and so we got to get out of there. And we get our crampons on, and I haven't even been on my feet yet. I've just been sitting on that pack, and my neck was killing me. I remember that. And then, so and all his gear is in the snow cave, and you can't get it at it. It was recovered later, but he doesn't have access to any of that. His glasses are in there, and the guy can't see without his glasses. So we decide to get going, and he takes off ahead of me, and I get up to follow him, and I go boom, right on my face. And it's because I'm probably in the early stages or some stage of hypothermia, and I'm weak, and I had done most of the leading through that deep snow because Ed kept sinking in because he's short and I was at least a little taller and could do it a little faster. And if you weren't in the lead and the other guy's going through that snow, you get cold really fast. So anyway, he takes off and he goes about, I don't know how far, 30, 40 yards. And I get up a second time and I go down a second time. And he's looking, and I go, like this, and he comes back, and we get up, and we get arm in arm, and we start walking down the mountain, and this is amazing. There were some crevasses out at this time. I mean, down on the Emmons, up high, and he's kicking, creating little snowballs with his feet. So it starts rolling down. He can't see without his glasses. And he's seeing these balls disappear. Then he knows it's a crevasse. Pretty sharp, huh? So we finally get down, and so there's kind of the situation. We get into the gap there, the gap right between Columbia Crest and Liberty Cap, and we come down the Emmons. And as we come down, he's in the lead, and about the last few hundred feet, I'm starting to really feel pretty good. And I actually went up ahead of him and walked into camp a little ahead of him. And I mean, you'd think I'd been to I don't know where, but I don't know why I could look like that after what had almost happened to me, because absolute truth that I've never been closer to death in the mountains than that night up there. And all the situations I've been in, I never had that sense. I was always confident, no matter what it was, and some of you know what some of those are, that I would never give in, that I would always get through it some way. This one, I was not quite thinking like that. So that makes what Ed did even more remarkable. And we get down to the hut, and the window was open a little bit, so he figured out a way to get in there. He went around to the food cooler in the back and got some goodies back there, and then he's cooking for me. And I had been hyperventilating at some point on the mountain higher, and so I really had a lot of pain in the chest, and but here we are, and we went out one time and trying to start to go down, and we virtually almost were blowing off the platform of the hut. And finally, the storm broke, and it's now the 18th. We've been up there 8 days on Rainier. And my grandmother died early in that 8 days. And then as we were delayed, they were holding the funeral, and I'm sure my wife, Mary Lou, was thinking at some point about, and what really got her was when the Sherpas showed up at the front door. What are these guys doing here? This is serious stuff, was her reaction. So anyway, the storm finally blows out, and I'm looking back up at the hut, just a little bit of the hut sticking up there on the skyline below the rocks. And I don't know, I just wanted this last memory of what we'd been through. And so I snapped this photo, and it did, and here are the Sherpas who met us later in the day, and we spent another night down in the White River campground on one of the porches of one of the ranger huts porches. We were there just lying on the porch, and we tried to flag down an old couple that was driving a car up over we walked out to the highway finally, and we flagged down this car, and here we look like, where have these people been? Who are they? How could they be so wild looking? And I remember the looks on their faces when they finally rolled down the window, and we said, "Are you going to White Pass?" would you please find Dave Mayer up there and tell him that we need his help, you know? And of course, I learned later Dave was out of the country, so that didn't do us any good. Anyway, we finally find a snowplow guy goes by, and he takes us back, and we're only about a quarter of a mile from their shed, which is down the road. So that's when it all breaks, and we know we're okay for sure. But here's, that's Barry Prather on the right, Fred Stanley, me in the middle, Ed, see what I tell you about short? And Howard Anderson on the far left. Fred's is up the highest in the photo. And Fred, I don't know where you are, but tell me who the guy in the white, is that Loki? Is Bill Loki? Is that the name? Where are you, Fred? Bill who? Bill Loki. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, I've got it right. That's great. All right. And there is my dear friend Ed Bolt, we never climbed together again. Not because he was on his way to 50, and that was old in those days, and it was just this was number 3 of mine, and so I didn't think I'd be doing any more, but I did, and I got lucky on that one, actually. But Ed was just a wonderful person. He just really did save my life. And I've said that in writing, and I've said it to people, and he, I don't know anyone that, some of, the Freds are great rescue guys. They're the people you want. It's the people, when you look at a fellow climber, what you're looking for is, if you need somebody to come looking for you, who do you want it to be? That's the test. So the next climb, and this is quick, this is Dusan Jagursky. And he was a Czech climber who came over when the Soviets invaded Prague in 1968. And he became a guide on Mount Rainier. He was a super good, really good climber from Europe. And we did some climbs together, including a Joachim Ridge climb. But he had tried Willis Wall twice before, and he was out in the middle on the central rib, and each time we're down to 2 minutes here. Yeah, okay. Each time they were on the climb, rock fall or avalanches, and what happens when climbers experience that on Willis Wall is they tend to run for the exits, whether it's over to Curtis Ridge on the east or Liberty Ridge on the west. And so he wanted we were in Alaska doing a fair weather climb with of all people, Fred Beckey. It was the only expedition I ever went on with him. What an experience that was. But Dusan was a figure of strength on that expedition, and so we decided that we wanted to go in, and we knew we didn't want to do the Mayer route through the ice cliffs, and the one we repeated that I did with Ed Bolton. And so why don't we go try to straighten out this is the 63 route that we did. Let's go straighten it out. Well, that blue line doesn't really straighten it out that much, does it? And what happened was that we started up, and there were some features. The rib is you can see it. It's where the red line is. So we ended up working our way back. But what happened? We get up with the Bergschrund, and we keep getting pushed out to the right into the gully, and there's too much slow rock. Again, speed counts. So we thought, well, if we just keep moving fast, we'll get up, and we did. And guess where we ended up? On top of the east rib, and that was familiar country. And so from there, we went up and we thought we were doing something kind of new, but it was really where Swain and Ed Cooper had gone. And by the end of it, it was just I don't have the slide that shows this easy walk. We got back down to, that's me with that. That's a slightly different that's a bigger JanSport. That wasn't bigger than the one we had on Willis Wall. But there's Doosan. And again, very sadly, Doosan was involved with an accident with Al Givler in the Fairweather Range in 1977. They would have been members of the 78 K2, they were members of the 78 K2 expedition. And we had gone with Steve Martz, who was going to film the whole thing, to climb this unclimbed, unnamed peak. And it was a wonderful climb. Got to the summit at midnight, and Steve and I went off the summit first, starting the descent. And when Al and Doosan came off, one of them slipped, pulled the other one off, and they went down the north side of the mountain, and it did not survive the fall. So here's the last thing I'm going to say, and I'm violating the 2-minute rule, and I'm going to skip this. But here's all the routes I did are all those different colors. But I just want to point one thing out. Up, you see that right there, that little line, and it has 1976 next to it. This is the news tonight, actually. This is Willis Wall news, because that was the ramp that Alex and I were trying to do, the one that they're showing the 76 guys, 2 guys, Jack Lewis and Bob. Let's see, it wasn't Bob. Tom Boley. 2 young guys came up, and Becky. This is Becky's graph in his own Rainier guidebook. And so I'm thinking, leading into this talk stirred this inquiry. Fred managed to track down Boley, and I got his phone number, called him, and we're on the phone for about 45 minutes, and he's talking about Willis Wall, and he's telling me about their experience. And at the very end, just as he's signing off, he says, I got to tell you, Fred Becky got our route wrong. We didn't go up the way off the route the way he has it in his guidebook. He says, we were over to the left. And I said, okay, that was really surprise to me. So it's hard to see this, but right here, it's a kind of a purple thing that goes up the west rib. And Alex and I had gone up there. That was where our ramp was. Look where they went. Right through the ice cliff. And they said they had no vertical ice. It was 2 55-degree pitches of ice. And they went through there, and I said, aha, the second complete Willis Wall route. If you believe complete means either you don't get to go off at the sides, and of course I'm only batting 500 because I went off to the side twice, and only went up Dave's route twice. So it's too technical. I mean, anybody who goes on Willis Wall and does that kind of climbing up there in that hostile environment ought to be given a lot of due and not try to make these fine refinements about what was a more worthy route versus a different one. So I really am impressed with these guys. Now I looked through all the photos I've got through the years that show that part of the mountain. And usually they're like, some of them are on our Dave Mayer climb in 63 that show that where that avalanche was, the only avalanche we saw, you remember that photo? Their route goes right up where that avalanche was. So, you know, if you pick your conditions, you can probably be okay, but that's never going to become a favorite route. Now, the last thing I've done, and this is true, and it's 10 after, not 8 after, Willis Wall has never had a fatality on it. The only fatalities that are anywhere near Willis Wall, there have been some on Curtis, and there have been a fair amount on Liberty, and the only thing that happened on Willis Wall was that guided group that was doing a Liberty Ridge climb a few years ago, and 6 of them, they put tents up at the top of the Black Pyramid, and there was a storm and new snow, and their tents, and 6 of them were swept down that gully that I talked about that divides Liberty Ridge from Willis Wall. And it's the same gully that has its own route called thermogenesis by a team of 5 or 6 that was going up the gully. And the reason they were in that gully going up was because in the dark they got lost thinking they were going up the West Rib. So, and surprisingly, there are very few climbs of Willis Wall being done these days. Since 2010, there's just one day when 6 people made it up Willis Wall. Now, what I don't know is, was that 6 in one group? Was it 3 and 3? Was it 2, 2, and 2? It's probably safe, I'll conclude with this observation. It probably wasn't, there wasn't a solo climber involved. We'll leave that to Charlie Bell. And he really, you know, he did something that was very remarkable. So I want to thank you for your patience. And I apologize for my voice. It's not, maybe not this bad, but I got some things going on in it. And so, but it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to come kind of out of retirement of even speaking to people about climbing, to come here and have this kind of evening with you. And I'm really appreciative of WD for talking to me opening night when Fred and I were here about, well, gee, would you ever consider coming back to talk about Willis Wall? And I said yes, I would. And so that's why I'm here. And Dunham is trying to get me to, he says, well, now I've got you for some other appearances with this. Sorry, Fred. I'm going back into retirement. So, all right, thank you so much. That's not what I thought I'd do.
Jim Wickwire, what a guy. And give it up for Fred Dunham and Fred Stanley. Fred Stanley right up there. Fred Dunham right there. Thanks, everybody.